The fluorescent lights of Chicago Memorial Hospital hummed with their usual monotonous buzz as Dr. Eleanor Morrison finished her rounds on the third floor. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, and the autumn wind rattled the windows of the old building, carrying with it the scent of impending rain. Elena rubbed her tired eyes, her navy blue scrubs wrinkled from the 14-hour shift that was supposed to have ended 3 hours ago. At 38 years old, Elena had devoted her entire adult life to emergency medicine. Her dark hair, now streaked with premature grey, was pulled back in a messy bun. The lines around her hazel eyes told stories of countless sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Tonight had been particularly brutal. A multi-car pile-up on the interstate had flooded the ER with trauma cases, and she'd lost a patient on the operating table, despite her best efforts. "Doctor, Morrison, you should head home," said Marcus, the night security guard, as she passed the nurse's station. His concerned expression reflected what everyone who worked with Eleanor knew. She pushed herself too hard, stayed too late, and carried the weight of every patient she couldn't save. "Just finishing up some charts," Elena replied, managing a weak smile. "I'll be out of here soon." The truth was, she wasn't eager to return to her empty apartment in Lincoln Park. After her divorce 3 years ago, the silence of home had become almost oppressive. At least the hospital was alive with purpose, even at midnight. Elena made her way to her small office on the second floor, passing through dimly lit corridors that felt different at this hour, longer, more echoing. The administrative wing was deserted, most offices dark. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, flicking on the desk lamp rather than the harsh overhead lights. As she settled into her chair and opened the first patient file, a sound made her freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming down the corridor outside her office. Eleanor's heart rate quickened. Security made rounds, but Marcus's footsteps were lighter, more casual. These were different, purposeful, stopping just outside her door. The handle turned slowly. Elena's breath caught in her throat as the door swung open, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the hallway's dim lighting. A man, broad-shouldered and imposing, stepped into her office. In the lamplight, she could see he was in his early 40s, with a weather-worn face, dark stubble, and intense grey eyes that seemed to assess everything in an instant. He wore a black jacket and jeans, and his hands, Elena's medical training immediately noted, were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them for a living. "Dr. Morrison," he said, his voice deep and steady, though Eleanor detected something beneath it. Urgency, perhaps desperation. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" Eleanor's voice trembled despite her effort to sound authoritative. Her hand moved instinctively toward the phone on her desk. The man raised both hands in a placating gesture, but he also moved forward, letting the door close behind him with a soft click that sounded deafening in the quiet office. "Please, I need to talk to you." "It's about—" "Stop right there!" Eleanor commanded, standing up so quickly her chair rolled backward and hit the wall. Her legs felt weak, but adrenaline was flooding her system. "I'm calling security." "Wait, please." The man's voice cracked slightly, and Elena saw something shift in his expression. Not threat, but pain. Raw, unmistakable pain. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because you're the only one who can help me understand what happened to my daughter." Elena's hand hovered over the phone. "Your daughter?" "Madison Reeves. She was your patient 4 months ago." The man's jaw clenched, and Elena could see he was fighting to maintain his composure. "She died in your ER, and I need to know why." The name hit Elena like a physical blow. Madison Reeves, 8 years old, brought in unconscious after a fall at school. They'd done everything. But the little girl had massive internal bleeding, and by the time they'd identified the extent of the injuries, it was too late. Eleanor had been the one to tell the father, this man standing before her now, that his daughter hadn't made it. She remembered his collapse, the sound that had torn from his throat, something between a roar and a sob that still haunted her dreams. "Mr. Reeves," Eleanor said softly, her fear beginning to morph into something else, professional concern mixed with empathy. I understand you're grieving, but this isn't the way to— They told me it was just a fall, he interrupted, his voice rising. Kids fall all the time. How does a healthy 8-year-old girl die from falling off playground equipment? The autopsy report doesn't make sense. The school's report doesn't match what the hospital told me. And when I try to get answers, everyone gives me the runaround, tells me to talk to someone else, to file another form, to wait for another review. He took another step forward, and Elena instinctively moved backward, her hip bumping against the desk. Mr. Reeves, please. I've been trying to get answers through official channels for 4 months, he continued, his voice breaking. 4 months of being passed from office to office, being treated like I'm crazy for wanting to understand why my little girl died. So yes, I came here tonight. I waited until late because I knew you'd be here. Everyone says Dr. Morrison never leaves, and I knew you'd talk to me without hospital lawyers and administrators standing between us. Elena's mind was racing. She remembered Madison's case clearly. She remembered every child she lost. The fall had caused a splenic rupture and internal hemorrhaging, but there had been something else, something unusual about the case that had bothered her at the time. What was it? Mr. Reeves, I can't discuss patient cases outside of proper channels, Eleanor began, but even as she said it, she could hear how hollow it sounded. This was a father in agony, and she knew better than anyone how the bureaucracy of the medical system could re-traumatize grieving families. Please, he said, and suddenly the intimidating figure before her seemed to crumble slightly. His shoulders sagged, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Please don't hurt me with more bureaucratic bullshit. I can't move forward. I can't sleep. I can't breathe without knowing what really happened to my daughter. You were there. You tried to save her. I saw it in your eyes that night. You cared. So please, just talk to me. Person to person. Parent to— He stopped, his voice catching. I'm all she had. Single dad. Just the two of us. And now— Elena felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She thought of her own childhood, of her father who had raised her alone after her mother died. She thought of the sacred trust between a parent and a doctor, and she made a decision that went against every hospital policy, every legal protection, every professional boundary she'd been taught to maintain. Sit down, she said quietly, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Tell me everything you remember about the day Madison fell, and then we'll figure out what really happened. As James Reeves sank into the chair, relief washing over his exhausted features, Eleanor pulled up Madison's file on her computer. She had a feeling this was going to be a long night, but perhaps finally some answers would emerge from the tragedy that had haunted them both. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, drops pattering against the window of Elena's office like impatient fingers. James Reeves sat across from her, his large frame seeming somehow smaller now, folded into the chair as if the weight of grief had physically compressed him. Elena had made them both coffee from the small machine she kept in her office. Terrible coffee, but hot and caffeinated, which was what they needed for the conversation ahead. Start from the morning, Elena said gently, her professional demeanor softening into something more human. Walk me through everything. James wrapped his hands around the coffee mug, staring into it as if seeing that day replay in the dark liquid. Madison woke up excited. It was a Friday, and her class was having a field day, outdoor activities, games, the whole thing. She loved school. His voice caught slightly on the past tense. She was always the first one ready in the morning, backpack on, waiting by the door. That day was no different. Did she seem sick at all? Any complaints? Eleanor asked, pulling up Madison's medical history on her computer. Nothing. She was perfectly healthy. I made her favorite breakfast, chocolate chip pancakes. She ate 2 of them, drank her juice, grabbed her lunchbox. James's jaw tightened. I dropped her off at 8:15. She hugged me goodbye and ran to meet her friends. That was the last time I saw her conscious. Elena scanned through the records. Madison Reeves had been a healthy child. Regular checkups, vaccinations up to date, no chronic conditions. One notation caught her eye. A prescription for antibiotics 6 weeks before the incident, for a throat infection. Otherwise, completely normal. "What time did the school call you?" Elena asked. 10:47 a.m. I was at a construction site. I'm a contractor. Was supervising a renovation in Oak Park. The school nurse said Madison had fallen on the playground and was complaining of stomach pain. They said it didn't seem too serious, but they thought I should come pick her up. James's hands tightened around the mug. I got there by 11:20. They had her lying down in the nurse's office. She was pale, Dr. Morrison, so pale. And when I touched her, she was cold. Eleanor leaned forward. "What did the school tell you about the fall? That she'd been playing on the monkey bars during recess and fell about 4 feet onto the rubber safety mat. The playground monitor said Madison stood up right away, said she was fine, and kept playing for a few minutes. Then she went to her teacher and said her stomach hurt. Did you see any witnesses? Other kids who saw the fall?" James nodded. "I talked to her best friend, Emma Chen. Emma said they were taking turns on the monkey bars, and Madison just slipped. Said it didn't look like a bad fall. Kids fall harder than that all the time on that playground." Elena was typing notes, her medical mind working through the timeline. "What happened when you got her to the ER?" "She was getting worse in the car, more pale, holding her stomach. By the time I carried her through the ER doors, she was barely responsive." James's voice cracked. "They took her right away. You came in, you asked me questions, but I could see it in your face. Something was really wrong." Elena remembered it vividly. The little girl's blood pressure had been dangerously low, her abdomen rigid and distended, classic signs of internal bleeding. They'd rushed her for imaging, and the CT scan had shown the catastrophic truth. Her spleen had ruptured and she was hemorrhaging internally. "We did everything we could," Elena said quietly. "Emergency surgery, transfusions. But the damage was too extensive. By the time we identified the full extent of the bleeding—" "I know you tried," James said, meeting her eyes for the first time since he'd started talking. "I've never blamed you for that. But here's what doesn't make sense, Dr. Morrison. The autopsy report said Madison's spleen was already damaged before the fall. Something about pre-existing tissue degradation and unusual fragility. But what does that mean?" Elena pulled up the autopsy report she'd requested access to after James left. She'd read it 3 times when it first came through, and each time the same questions had nagged at her. The pathologist had noted that Madison's spleen showed signs of damage that seemed inconsistent with a simple playground fall. "I need to ask you something," Elena said carefully. "In the weeks before the accident, did Madison seem tired? Any unexplained bruising, frequent nosebleeds?" James's brow furrowed. "Actually, yeah. She had a nosebleed about 2 weeks before. Woke up with blood on her pillow. I thought maybe she'd scratched herself in her sleep, and she did seem more tired than usual. I figured it was just end-of-school-year exhaustion." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She began pulling up test results from Madison's ER admission. The complete blood count, the metabolic panel. There, in the numbers, was something she'd noted at the time, but hadn't fully processed in the chaos of trying to save the child's life. "Mr. Reeves, James, I think Madison's spleen didn't rupture because of the fall. I think the fall happened because her spleen was already compromised, and she was experiencing internal bleeding that made her weak and dizzy." James set down his coffee mug with shaking hands. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Madison might have had an underlying condition that no one diagnosed. Look at these numbers." Eleanor turned her monitor so James could see. Though she knew the medical data would mean little to him, her platelet count was low. Her spleen showed signs of disease on the autopsy. "James, I think Madison might have had an undiagnosed blood disorder, possibly ITP, immune thrombocytopenic purpura, or something similar." "A blood disorder?" James's face had gone pale. But she just had a checkup 6 months ago. They said she was fine. These conditions can develop quickly, and the symptoms can be subtle. The nosebleed, the fatigue, the bruising. Those were warning signs, but they're also things that can seem normal in an active kid. Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. If this is what happened, then the fall didn't kill Madison. She was already sick, and no one knew. James stood up abruptly, turning away from her to face the window. His shoulders were shaking. So it wasn't the school's fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. She was just sick. I can't be certain without more investigation, Elena said, but I think we need to look deeper. Did Madison see her regular pediatrician in those weeks before? Any other doctors? Dr. Patel. The antibiotic prescription was from him, for strep throat. James turned back to face her, and Eleanor saw something new in his expression. Not just grief, but desperate hope. Hope that there might be an answer, an explanation that made sense of the senseless. I need to see Dr. Patel's records, Elena said, already reaching for her phone. And I need to call the pathologist who did Madison's autopsy. If I'm right about this, James, it means that Madison's death wasn't caused by the fall. The fall was a symptom of a bigger problem. And if that's true, then maybe other kids could have the same thing, James finished, his voice hoarse. Maybe we could save someone else from going through this. Elena nodded. But I have to warn you, this is going to open up a lot of questions about why the condition wasn't caught earlier, about whether there was any medical negligence. It's going to be painful. James met her gaze steadily. Dr. Morrison, I've been living in hell for 4 months, not knowing why my daughter died. Pain I can handle. What I can't handle is not knowing the truth. As Elena began making calls, to the pathologist, to medical records, to a hematologist colleague, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. This wasn't just about one tragic case anymore. This was about uncovering the truth, learning from it, and potentially saving other lives. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing against the windows like tears. But inside Elena's small office, 2 people who had been lost in their own separate griefs were finally beginning to find their way toward understanding. Thank you, James said quietly, as Eleanor waited for the pathologist to answer. Thank you for listening, for caring, for not just treating me like a problem to be managed. Elena covered the phone's mouthpiece and gave him a small, sad smile. I became a doctor to help people. Sometimes that means saving lives in the ER, and sometimes it means sitting in an office at midnight, helping a father find the truth about his daughter. Both matter just as much. The pathologist answered, and Elena dove into the technical conversation about splenic tissue analysis and blood disorders. James watched her work, and for the first time since that terrible day in April, he felt like he wasn't alone in his search for answers. The night was far from over, and the real investigation was just beginning. The clock on Elena's wall read 3:47 a.m. when she finally leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes with the heels of her hands. The office was cluttered with papers now. Printed autopsy reports, medical records, test results, and notes she'd scribbled during phone calls with 4 different specialists. James had fallen asleep around 2 a.m., his head resting on his folded arms on the corner of her desk, exhausted by months of sleepless nights and the emotional weight of the evening's revelations. Elena looked at him for a moment, this father who had seemed so threatening just hours ago. In sleep, the lines of grief and anger were still visible on his face, etched there permanently by loss. She thought about her own father, how he'd aged a decade in the year after her mother died. Grief was a physical thing, she knew. It changed you, marked you, became part of your body's landscape. The latest email notification chimed softly on her computer. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hematologist from Northwestern who had been reviewing Madison's case files, had sent her preliminary analysis. Elena clicked it open, her exhaustion forgotten as she read through the detailed findings. "James," she said softly, reaching over to gently shake his shoulder. "James, wake up. I have something." He stirred, lifting his head with confusion, before memory returned and his eyes focused on her. "What time is it?" "Almost 4, but I just heard back from Dr. Chen at Northwestern. James, I think we found it." James sat up fully, suddenly alert despite the hour. "Found what?" Elena turned her monitor so he could see, though once again she knew she'd need to translate the medical terminology. Dr. Chen reviewed all of Madison's test results from the ER, the autopsy findings, and the records from her pediatrician visits. "She agrees with my suspicion. Madison had an undiagnosed blood disorder, but it's more specific than I thought." She pulled up an image from the autopsy report, showing microscopic slides of tissue samples. Madison had something called aplastic anemia. It's a rare condition where the bone marrow fails to produce enough blood cells, red cells, white cells, and platelets. Without enough platelets, blood doesn't clot properly, and organs can bleed internally with even minor trauma. James was staring at the screen, trying to process. But how did no one catch this? She had checkups. She saw doctors. "That's the devastating part," Eleanor said, her voice heavy. "Aplastic anemia can develop quickly, sometimes over just a few weeks. The symptoms in early stages are subtle: fatigue, pale skin, frequent infections, easy bruising. All things that can be mistaken for normal childhood illnesses, especially during cold and flu season." She pulled up Madison's pediatric records from Dr. Patel. "Look here, 6 weeks before the accident, Madison was treated for strep throat with antibiotics. But if you look at the blood work, Dr. Patel ordered, there were already warning signs. Her red blood cell count was slightly low, not dramatically low, but lower than her previous records." "Why didn't Dr. Patel notice?" James asked, his voice tight. "Because he was treating a strep infection. And in that context, slightly low red cells can happen with any illness. It wasn't alarming enough to trigger further investigation." Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "But Dr. Chen and I both agree that if Dr. Patel had compared it to Madison's historical baseline more carefully, or if he'd ordered a more comprehensive panel, the anemia might have been caught." James stood up and walked to the window, his fists clenching and unclenching. "So this could have been prevented?" "Maybe, possibly. We can't know for certain." Eleanor kept her voice steady, professional, even as her heart ached for what she was about to tell him. "Aplastic anemia is treatable, especially if caught early. Treatments include blood transfusions, medications to stimulate blood cell production, and in severe cases, bone marrow transplants. If Madison had been diagnosed even 2 weeks before the fall, she would likely be alive today." The silence that followed was broken only by the continued rain against the window and the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Elena watched James's shoulders shake and knew he was crying, silently, facing away from her to maintain some dignity in his grief. "But here's what else Dr. Chen found," Elena continued gently. "And this is important, James. When she reviewed the antibiotic that Dr. Patel prescribed for Madison's strep throat," James turned around, tears streaming down his face. "What about it?" "In very rare cases, we're talking less than 1 in 100,000, that particular antibiotic can trigger aplastic anemia in patients who have a specific genetic predisposition." Eleanor stood up and moved around the desk to stand closer to him. "Dr. Chen wants to test Madison's stored tissue samples for genetic markers. If she had this predisposition, it means the antibiotic might have been what triggered her condition. The medicine that was supposed to help her killed her." James's voice was raw, barely above a whisper. "We don't know that for certain yet. She might have developed aplastic anemia anyway. It can be idiopathic, meaning it develops with no identifiable cause. But there's a possibility that the antibiotic was a contributing factor in someone with a genetic vulnerability." James sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. "What do we do with this information?" Elena sat down beside him, not behind her desk, but in the chair next to his, closing the professional distance between them. "We do several things. First, I'm going to file a formal case review with the hospital's medical board and recommend that all of Madison's care providers be reviewed, not for punishment, but to identify what protocols might have prevented this from being missed. Will Dr. Patel lose his license? I don't know. That's not my decision. But healthcare providers have a responsibility to stay vigilant, to recognize patterns, to order appropriate follow-up tests when something seems off. Whether he met that standard is something the medical board will determine. Second, Elena continued, I'm going to work with Dr. Chen to publish a case study about Madison's case. Not using her name, of course, but documenting the clinical progression, the warning signs, and the genetic factors. This could help other doctors recognize similar cases earlier. James looked up at her, his eyes red but focused. You mean Madison's death could help save other kids? Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Cases like Madison's, as tragic as they are, become learning opportunities for the entire medical community. Every doctor who reads about her case will be more alert to the signs of aplastic anemia, more likely to order additional tests when blood counts are borderline, more aware of the rare side effects of common medications. For the first time, since he'd walked into her office 6 hours ago, something like peace crossed James's face. She'd like that. Madison always wanted to help people. She told me once she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. His voice broke. She wanted to be like the doctors at this hospital who were always so kind when she came in for checkups. Eleanor felt her own eyes filling with tears. She would have been an amazing doctor. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the night settling over them. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. "What about you?" James asked suddenly. "The hospital. Are you going to get in trouble for telling me all this, for looking into the case on your own?" Elena smiled sadly. "Probably. I broke about a dozen protocols tonight. I could face disciplinary action for discussing a patient case with a family member outside proper channels, for accessing records without authorization, for involving outside specialists without hospital approval. Then why did you do it?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Elena said simply. "Because you deserved answers. Because Madison deserved to have someone fight for the truth about what happened to her. And because somewhere along the way, in all my years of practicing medicine, I remembered why I became a doctor in the first place. Not to protect hospitals from liability, not to follow bureaucratic protocols, but to help people." James extended his hand, and Elena took it. His grip was firm, the handshake of a man who worked with his hands, built things, fixed things. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for caring, for fighting, for helping me understand." "Thank you for not giving up," Elena replied, "for pushing for answers even when everyone tried to make you go away. You're a good father, James. Madison was lucky to have you." As the first rays of sunrise began to paint the sky outside in shades of pink and gold, Elena's phone buzzed with a text from the hospital administrator. Someone, probably Marcus the security guard, had reported that a non-staff member had been in the building all night. Elena was being summoned to a meeting at 9 a.m. to explain herself. She showed the text to James, who immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get you in trouble." "Don't be sorry," Elena said, shutting down her computer and gathering the files they'd compiled. "Whatever happens in that meeting, I'll handle it. You need to go home, get some sleep, and start processing everything we learned tonight. And James," she paused, looking at him seriously, "you need to start grieving properly, not just looking for answers, but actually letting yourself feel the loss. Madison deserves to be mourned, not just investigated." James nodded, tears flowing freely now. "Will you come to her grave with me sometime? I'd like to tell her that we figured it out, that her death will mean something." "I'd be honored," Elena said softly. They walked together through the now bustling morning corridors of the hospital, the night shift giving way to day, the ER filling up with the usual chaos of a Friday morning. At the main entrance they paused. "Dr. Morrison," James said, "when I came here last night, I was angry. I thought maybe you'd been negligent or that you didn't care. I was wrong. You're one of the good ones." "We're all just trying our best," Elena replied. "Sometimes our best isn't enough, and that's the hardest part of being human. But we keep trying, we keep learning, we keep fighting for the truth." James Reeves walked out into the early morning light, his shoulders a little straighter than when he'd arrived, his burden shared instead of carried alone. Elena watched him go, then turned back to face the hospital and whatever consequences awaited her for choosing compassion over protocol. Later that morning, in the administrator's office, Elena would present her findings about Madison Reeves's case. She would face questions, criticism, and potential disciplinary action. But she would also set in motion a series of changes. New protocols for follow-up on abnormal blood counts in pediatric patients, a hospital-wide training on recognizing rare blood disorders, and a partnership with Dr. Chen to establish a genetic testing program for patients prescribed high-risk antibiotics. 6 months later, those new protocols would catch an early case of aplastic anemia in a 7-year-old boy, and his life would be saved. When the boy's mother asked the attending physician how they'd caught it so early, the doctor would say, "We learned from a case a while back, a little girl named Madison who taught us to look closer." And in a cemetery in Oak Park, where a father visited his daughter's grave every Sunday, a small stone marker bore the inscription, "Madison Rose Reeves. Beloved daughter, her light shines on in the lives she saved." Because sometimes, even in the darkest tragedies, the human spirit finds a way to transform pain into purpose, grief into growth, and loss into legacy. That's what James learned in those long hours in Dr. Morrison's office. That's what Elena remembered about why she became a doctor. And that's what Madison's short life ultimately meant. Not just a tragedy, but a catalyst for change that would echo through the years in lives saved and families spared the same heartbreak. The truth, they both discovered, doesn't take away the pain, but it does give it meaning, and sometimes that's enough.